Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us tonight for this very important information session to learn more about the proposed 2023 municipal budget. My name is Kelly Brooks, and I will be your moderator for this session. I'd like to start by thanking Mayor Paul Lefebvre for joining us tonight, along with Deb McIntosh, Councillor for Ward 9 and Chair of the Finance and Administration Committee, and Fern Cormier, Councillor for Ward 10 and Vice Chair of the Finance and Administration Committee. Each will be available during the question and answer period following the presentation. I also want to take a minute to introduce our executive leadership team and budget staff here with us. They will also be on hand to answer your questions about the budget and budget process. Ed Archer, Chief Administrative Officer, Kevin Folk, General Manager of Corporate Services, Steve Jakes, General Manager of Community Safety, Joseph Nichols, Community Development, Steve. Joseph Nichols, General Manager of Community Safety. Joe Rocca, our Director of Infrastructure Capital Planning, who's filling in tonight for Tony Cicuti, General Manager of Growth and Infrastructure. Ian Wood, Executive Director of Strategic Initiatives, Communications and Citizen Services. Marie L'Italian, Director of Communications and Engagement, and Meredith Armstrong, Director of Economic Development. Tonight's session will begin with a presentation, which will last approximately 30 minutes, followed by a 1-hour question and answer period. We will be taking questions tonight through the Q&A tool you see on your screen. You're welcome to ask questions through that tool at any time. As a follow-up, we will be publishing your questions with the answers on the city's 2023 budget project page on our Over to You engagement platform in the coming days. That's at overtoyou.greatersudbury.ca. As well, we are keeping the Q&A tool open on Over to You and will continue to accept and answer questions until February 15th. Just a reminder that this session is being held via Zoom and it is being recorded. It will also be available on Over to You. Closed captioning is an option. You can go to live transcript to turn that on and off. And now we will begin with opening remarks from Mayor Lefebvre. Mayor?
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you for being our moderator this evening. So I look forward to a review of the budget and to hearing the questions that residents of the City of Greater Sudbury have regarding the 2023 budget. I want to thank Councillor McIntosh, Chair of the Finance and Administrative Committee, as well as Councillor Cormier, the Vice Chair. And as Kelly mentioned, the whole team that is here, Ed Archer, Kevin Folk, Steve Jakes, Meredith Armstrong, Mr. Roca, Madame L'Italien is here as well, Mr. Nichols. Hope I'm not missing anybody, but Mr. Folk, I think I mentioned your name. I want to make sure that I all thank you for joining us and for providing your perspective as well as taking questions this evening. And finally, I want to thank the people of the City of Greater Sudbury for joining us tonight and providing your questions and being engaged in this process. It's important that we hear from you. It's also sometimes important that you hear from the people here that are putting the budget together to respond, to answer those questions that you have, and certainly your concerns and some suggestions that you have as well. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Kelly, but looking forward to this evening's questions and answers. Merci beaucoup.
Great. Thank you, Mayor Lefebvre. I'll turn it over now to Councillor McIntosh to say a few words.
Good evening, and thank you, Kelly, and thank you, Mayor Lefebvre. I want to thank everyone for joining us here tonight to learn more about the city's 2023 draft budget and to ask questions. Our annual budget is the city's yearly plan to pay for the services we deliver and Our annual budget is the city's yearly plan to pay for the services we deliver and the buildings, pipes, and roads that support those services. Every year, Council provides staff with direction on producing a budget that is fiscally responsible and provides residents with the services they've come to rely on, all while keeping an eye on what we want our city to look like in 5, 10, or 20 years from now. This year, Council directed staff to develop a draft budget that was no more than a 3.7 increase from 2022. We also asked our service partners to follow the same guideline. Service partners are organizations funded partly by municipal taxes, but controlled by separate boards of directors. They include the Greater Sudbury Police Services, Greater Sudbury Public Library, Conservation Sudbury, Public Health Sudbury and Districts, and the Sudbury Airport. City staff have developed a proposed budget that aligns with council's direction and strategic priorities. These priorities include a high level of service delivery, planning, building, and maintaining sustainable buildings, roads, and pipes, responding to climate change. Council's priorities also include making strategic investments that foster economic growth and development, ensuring safe, affordable housing for all residents, and making Greater Sudbury a healthy and vibrant community to live, work, play, and invest. The proposed 2023 budget looks to achieve these priorities through sustainable investments in roads, facilities, and community services. These investments are made through the operating budget, the money for day-to-day services like parks, police, and plowing, and the capital budget, the money for investments in roads, buildings, and pipes. Every year, council receives feedback from public engagement where you tell us what is important to you. This year, you told us that winter maintenance and road maintenance and construction were your top priorities. Of the proposed capital budget of $155 million, nearly 1/3 or $51 million is dedicated to road work. You also told us that water and wastewater, emergency services, garbage and recycling were important to you. And you'll see in the proposed 2023 budget that the capital budget supports asset renewal in these areas as well. Your input is important to the budget process. Tonight, you have the opportunity to hear a presentation on the proposed budget and ask your questions. Council will begin budget deliberations on February the 15th. Until that time, we on council are reading the 624-page document and asking our questions that are being answered by staff and representatives of the outside boards. We encourage you to review these questions and answers, which are all published along with the 624-page budget document on the city's website at greatersudbury.ca/budget. With that, I will turn it over to Ed Archer, our Chief Administrative Officer, and Kevin Folk, our General Manager of Corporate Services, to share with you a presentation on the proposed budget for our community. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Councillor McIntosh. Thanks also, Mayor Lefebvre and Councillor Cormier for joining us this evening. And as well to my colleagues from the organization supporting tonight's discussion. I appreciate the opportunity to work with you here to address questions from residents that may influence council's deliberations around the 2023 budget and hopefully inform as well people's understanding of the choices that were made to produce the plan that council has asked us to deliver and support service delivery throughout the year. Now, there's a brief presentation to support this conversation. And so I'll start by just reminding everybody that this is a process that's been going on for several months. In June of last year, as we do every year, staff presented a report to the Finance Administration Committee that described a variety of conditions that we believe would influence our capacity for service and performance in 2023. The objective of the report was to establish some parameters, some directions that council gave us to work with building this draft plan for their review and eventual approval. Now, later this month, as Councillor McIntosh noted, there will be some meetings where deliberations will happen and votes will be taken about what service levels look like in 2023. It's really important to remember that among all the choices that are made around the budget process, it's the services that we deliver that drive the costs. We have a variety of service lines that are all interesting to members of the community. Now, not all of us, or perhaps very few of us, have used all of our municipal services, but we've all used some of them, and they're all important to someone. So the choices we make about where levels of spending are invested and the service levels that council approve have a significant influence on the quality of life in the community and on businesses' capacity to fulfill their own service objectives. So we take every element of this process pretty deliberately and thoughtfully to ensure that where we can mitigate risks, we do so, and where we can facilitate the objectives that residents have for their lifestyles or for businesses that have certain goals to achieve, the city is there to do its part. So as Councillor McIntosh noted, there's some top line information around what this plan includes that the typical resident would be interested in, because it reflects on how all of these services are going to come together And it also reflects the basis for determining property tax bills. So if you're a property owner in the city, you contribute to the quality of life in the community by paying property taxes, and then those in turn are translated into the services and service levels that we'll discuss tonight. Can I have the slides up on the screen, please? And we'll go to slide number 2. Thank you. So from the highest level perspective, we are in over 50 lines of service, and combined with our service partners, Greater Sudbury Police Service, Greater Sudbury Public Library, Conservation Sudbury, and Public Health Sudbury District, we have annual operating spending, that is spending on day-to-day services, of just over $700 million. Capital budget, which is the infrastructure investments we make in the community, is anticipated to include projects worth $155 million in 2023. Now, what's interesting about the capital budget is it fluctuates significantly year over year, according to the pace of the projects that are included in the plan. Many of the infrastructure projects we undertake are multi-year projects. They require several years to complete. And so there'll be ebbs and flows in cash flow that the budget reflects, and that reflects as well an overall level of asset renewal for the community that ensures that the infrastructure is there when we need it. Our water and wastewater budget is slightly different. It's part of the decision framework that council will consider in a few weeks, but it is not tax supported. It is entirely paid for by the users of the system. Now, its total budget is $94 million. That means, and because all of the municipality services have to be delivered within what's called a balanced budget, that is, revenues need to equal expenditures. The $94 million represents the revenue requirement for the water and wastewater service. And according to provincial legislation, that's the level of revenue required for what we call a sustainable water service. That's looking down the road and anticipating asset renewal investments that will ensure that there's a state of good repair maintained in the water and wastewater system, and that the water continues to be delivered safely and according to the standards that the province has issued all the licensed water providers to deliver throughout their service systems. Now, those figures are subject to council's further review. These are proposed budgets. They're recommendations based on the directions council gave us last June and staff's best advice about how to deliver the services that council asked us to include in this proposed budget. Now, overall, the plan currently maintains services and service levels, and it maintains those investments that you would expect a municipal government to deliver with respect to things like roads or facilities, and many community services that are delivered either in concert with other partners in the community or by the city directly. But like I said, there are a significant number of decisions associated with this plan, and careful consideration, both not just for affordability and the costs of the services, but the results that are expected to be produced from those service efforts as a result of all of the work that goes into delivering services day in and day out. Can I have the next slide, please? So it isn't simply just a matter of taking last year's figures and adjusting them to account for adjustments in the volume of work that's anticipated to change. There are several influencing factors that the city doesn't really control that can nonetheless influence the costs that we we're just talking about. Inflation this year has been a significant issue for all of us, whether it's local governments, whether it's private businesses, certainly homeowners, and families who are just simply, for example, shopping at a grocery store. You know, the price of everything has gone up, and that's been influenced by several factors like supply chain disruptions and the availability of labor. There are all kinds of influences on the costs of pretty much everything, and including the basket of services that municipalities rely on. The suppliers that provide service to us to deliver our programs and services are facing those same challenges. And so the price of things, notwithstanding that the service level may be the same, has changed. But we still as well have growing service demand for some of our services, and that's reflected in the planning information that we provide with the draft budget. And we have some new services. So in 2022's budget, council supported new services related to supervised consumption and transitional housing, anticipating that there would be provincial funding available by the end of 2022. That funding hasn't materialized yet. And these services, while important to the community, are what would traditionally be associated with provincial government responsibilities because they are health services, and that's not something that local governments typically provide. And so that funding is subject to further review in this budget process, and council may decide to change its level of support for those services based on ongoing discussions with the province and an expectation that the province will provide support for the health services that the community needs, including these ones. This process will figure that out. Legislative changes also influence the cost of our services and the way services can be delivered. And the most recent example I could point you to has to do with Bill 23, the provincial government's More Homes Built Faster Act. That's made a number of changes to the way municipalities plan the development in their community. But more significantly, from a budget perspective, it's also influenced the way municipalities pay for the infrastructure and the studies that support reasonable growth rates in their cities. And in this case, Bill 23 removed municipalities' opportunities to charge for certain studies or certain types of development, the kinds of charges that would avoid these costs being applied to taxpayers. Now they are direct costs to taxpayers instead of having them paid by the growth projects themselves. In 2023, our estimate is that that will cost us an additional $1 million in infrastructure costs that would have otherwise been paid for by third parties in previous years. Can I have the next slide, please? So there were significant cost pressures associated with all of these influencing factors. Back in June, when we described the approach to take for building this draft plan, and without any of the changes that were made between then and now, as presented last June, there would have been, to keep all the services going at the same level that we were providing them in 2022, about a 9.3% increase in property tax. Everybody knows that's unacceptable. Council asked us instead to build a plan that had no more than a 3.7% property tax change. That meant we needed to make $17.8 million in adjustments, whether that was new revenue opportunities or cost reductions, to create the budget that would produce a 3.7% tax change and no more. So we've done that. However, in January, as the police board is responsible for doing, it reviewed and approved the police services budget at a rate that was slightly higher than the projections we had been using to build the draft budget. And so there are some additional adjustments for council's consideration included in this plan that would, if approved, fulfill the 3.7% budget direction. However, the police service came in with a slightly higher budget. And so council has the opportunity to simply approve or not approve that budget. If it doesn't get approved, the police board can review it further and make adjustments if it wishes. If it stays as is, then there's a choice council makes to either accept those additional costs or make adjustments in other services to fund an overall plan that has no more than a 3.7% property tax change. Can I have the next slide? So this table simply shows you the variety of ways we made adjustments to remove the $17.8 million in costs that would be required for us to deliver a 3.7% change in the tax levy with the 2023 budget. There are, through these examples here, adjustments to the size of the capital plan. So the capital plan is $150 million. It would have been subject to other project proposals that were considered, but not included because of inflation factors, made a slightly larger plan. And council can review the suitability of the projects that we've included here and either take some projects out and add some other ones in, or add in some other projects that they consider to be priorities. But because of affordability concerns, we changed the overall level of capital spending plan for 2023 to bring the budget within the guideline. We also made some adjustments to our investment income revenue projections. So not just cost reductions, but also revenue increases. And so, for example, you see here, an additional investment income level of $3.6 million was included in the 2023 budget. Just because we have inflation investments on our cost side, the revenue side has some benefits from an inflation perspective because that increases the interest rate we earn on the money we invest. And so we recognize that by identifying additional investment income that reduces the pressure on the property tax. And you see other adjustments in here that reflect our experience and expected workload levels and the costs associated with that. And happy to address any specific issues, but the bottom line was we made adjustments to bring the plan in line with Council's guidelines. Can I have the next slide, please? So if there is no further debate and change in the draft plan, not likely, but if that was the case, if the plan was accepted as presented and a 3.7% property tax change was applied to bills for a typical home, you see illustrations here of what the change in taxation for a property would look like. So for a typical home assessed at $230,000, it's $122 change. If there was instead no change in the police budget and there were no other service adjustments to make the plan come in at a 3.7% change, that $122 would instead become $136. Now, we've talked for a long time in the community, and if you've been anywhere in the community, you recognize that some of the assets we use to provide the services you rely on are showing their age. So to address some of the asset renewal needs and to account for the potential for council to want to accelerate the level of capital reinvestment that we're making, there is a plan proposed for consideration in this draft budget that would see an additional 1.5% added to the levy specifically to address infrastructure renewal. If that was approved, then you would see here that same $230,000 assessed value property would have a tax change of $172, or if the police budget wasn't adjusted, $185 with the current approved police plan. So that said, I'll ask you to go to the next slide, please. Where those dollars go is to a variety of services that I've alluded to as being, in 50 lines of service. And so here's a brief summary. You see here the bulk of our expenditures relate to police services and road maintenance. As well, when you combine our social services, our fire and paramedic services, almost 2/3 of the budget is consumed by just that handful of services. Yet there are many more, and these are broad categories, I understand, of service where those property taxes are fundamentally important for the people that rely on our transit service or our recycling services or the businesses that rely on our economic development staff to collaborate with them and help them grow their plans. These all have consequences for the lifestyle in our community. Can I have the next slide, please? That said, notwithstanding the perceptions that some may have about the unacceptability of a tax change, our overall level of taxation is relatively low. If you take that same property that I was describing and use the same size lot that it would sit on in any of these communities and apply their tax rates to that same property, you get this comparison. And what this comparison shows you is that Greater Sudbury's taxes are among the lowest in the province for cities with more than 100,000 population, well below the median, well below the group average, and only really behind and very closely behind Windsor and Chatham-Kent. So from the perspective of an affordability assessment, of course, that's a subjective judgment, but we have a lot of this kind of benchmarking data. And we believe that these services that we're providing, which are also benchmarked against our peers, look relatively like the ones you'd see in other communities, and they're delivered at a cost that is significantly lower than those same kind of communities. Can I have the next slide, please? I'll ask now Kevin Folk, General Manager Corporate Services and responsible for our finance department, to provide some of the details behind the information presented for Council's consideration in the draft budget. Mr. Folk, over to you.
Thanks very much, Mr. Archer. Price changes that are on this slide are identified because of their budgetary significance, but B, also because I think a lot of residents and business owners would find them familiar. Inflation sits at 6.3% using the All Canada CPI index, and yet we know that the basket of goods that a municipality needs to provide services is generally 1 to 2% higher than that basket for the average household. And so these examples of fuel and diesel, for fuel and diesel, we budgeted a combined rate of $1.50 a liter. And that might make it okay for gas, but I know if you've been driving around town looking at diesel rates, that certainly is perhaps a bit of a risky assumption. Utilities, insurance costs, and salt and sand are provided here. So Mr. Archer has spoken to this inflationary dynamic in this particular year's budget. And these are a couple, I think, of really good examples that were significant price changes, and price changes that we continue to witness, not just in some of the supplies and the services that I've mentioned here, but in a lot of the work that we're bidding right across the organization, be it for the provision of day-to-day services or in some of our capital project work. The next slide, please. So all of the items on this slide are a part of the gap between the 2023 plans and forecasts and what we're tabling today. Mr. Archer has detailed some of the larger budget changes that were made to arrive at a net budget change within committee's guidance. The changes on this slide were arrived at by things like job combinations, taking advantage of enabling technology, assessing changes in our regulatory environment that allowed for a reduction in planned expenditures or an increase in revenues. I would point folks that are on the call this evening to page 70 of this year's budget document. It's a summary we present each year. And in that summary, you'll notice the puts and takes, the subtractions and additions of full-time positions and part-time hours. It gives the sense of the ongoing collaboration that takes place throughout the year as vacancies arise, in which priorities are examined, resources are pooled, and they're pooled to cover emerging planned or strategic priorities as we go. And so we're doing this all the time. There's a couple of good examples here on the slide to demonstrate that. So pooling of administrative resources, our one-stop services counter, which if you haven't visited Tom Davies Square, has been up and running for over a year now, providing service in one central location here at Tom Davies Square. And it's allowed us to combine some classifications of service and offer them all in one place and take advantage of savings and efficiencies that are generated in doing so. Credit card, debit card transactions. So a small fee there, taking some money off of the tax levy to be able to defray that overall increase and provide a reasonable fee for the convenience of using credit cards and debit cards for certain fees of the city. The last bullet point relates to the COMPASS system, which you'll recall stands for, and maybe you won't recall, so I'll tell you, it stands for Comprehensive Organizational Management Productivity Activity and Service System. And the data that system provides will allow us to do more of this work moving forward. An understanding of the service outcomes associated with literally every minute of staff time, and will help us better match service expectations with the resources required to produce them, and ensure our resources are properly deployed to address the city's highest priorities. The next slide, please. So on to the capital budget, then. This is a little bit like the operating budget slide that Mr. Archer just presented. What's in the capital budget? Well, it's comprised of $155 million in new and prior approved projects. These are investments City Council makes to sustain service levels now and into the future. So we talk about infrastructure spending. Well, these are investments, to put that on a practical footing, in the physical structures that you see around the city that are owned by the City of Greater Sudbury. The underground infrastructure that maybe you don't see that supports city services. Things like city buildings, roads, pipes in the ground, playground fixtures, equipment, and vehicles like buses and snowplows. The investments we're recommending complete work on prior capital budget priorities, so those that have been approved in the last several years' budgets. And we've prioritized roughly $68 million in new capital projects that are high priorities because they addressed a strategic objective. They lessen some kind of risk, regulatory or operational. They capitalize on funding opportunities, perhaps from senior orders of government or with synergies with other projects. So we're performing a road project that has water and wastewater or distribution collection pipe needs underneath, all of which are aligned with our enterprise asset management plan and our plans for various categories in that plan. The next slide, please. So where is the funding coming for this $155 million plan? Well, the budget does not anticipate any new external debt in 2023. The funding for the capital program is comprised mainly of the annual contributions to capital in this budget or in the budget year associated with prior year approvals. Next is user fees that you see here on the pie chart, comprised in the main of water wastewater fees, but also other user fee supported services like leisure services. Environmental service has some service fees, parking, and finally, the category of grants from senior orders of government. These are all detailed in total and by project in the capital budget section of the budget document. The next slide, please. So roughly a third of these projects are road projects. Among the new project priorities are bundles of library, leisure service, and emergency service facility upgrades and equipment, and repairs which, if approved, will be planned out and commence in some cases in 2023 and be completed in 2024 and 2025. These types of projects include 4 new arena roof replacements. A quarter of the planned expenditure is funded by the water waste rate budget rate, as indicated on the last slide, and is comprised of projects on water and wastewater treatment facilities and pipes in the ground that either collect or distribute flows across the community. The next slide, please. So the business cases that are in the document, on November the 30th, Council directed that 45 business cases be published for consideration during budget deliberations. Most of these arise from service level needs identified in 2022, and they were guided into the process by work of Council or Council committees or member motions from the last year or so. A set of these business cases, if approved, comprise service level adjustments equal to approximately $1.4 million that could be either used to reduce the net levy or could be considered in whole or in part to fund other desired service changes which would add to the net tax levy. The next slide, please. So unlike the municipal tax levy, which is applied to all properties to support services provided to the broader community, water and wastewater services are paid for by roughly 48,000 of our 70,000 residents and businesses based on the size of the service into their property, the actual amount of water consumption, and a surcharge based on that consumption to cover wastewater expenditures. Water and wastewater services are highly regulated. It's a class of assets that needs to be fully funded and sustainable at regulated service levels for the city to continue to obtain and renew its drinking water license. The budget you'll see described from page 481 in the budget document forward describes the rate impacts and the investments that will be made into water and wastewater operating and capital plans. The rate used reflects the 4.8% increase as anticipated in the water wastewater long-term financial plan. The next slide, please. So our service partners, the Greater Sudbury Airport is entirely self-funded. However, it relies on a couple of corporate services from the city, which are provided by an operating agreement. Conservation Sudbury, primarily funded by an operating grant from the city. Public Health Sudbury District have proposed a budget that calls for a 3.2% increase over its 2020 grant of just over $8 million. And the Greater Sudbury Police Services has the largest budget among our service partners at roughly $73 million and are funded almost exclusively from the tax levy. The Greater Sudbury Public Library's roughly $10 million budget is also, as you see, mainly funded by the tax levy. The next slide, please. And so I'll hand this back to Kelly now to continue on with questions from the folks that have joined us this evening on the call. We're beginning a process here now that we're in. Councillors and the community are reviewing our budget document. It's online. We're receiving questions and answers from both the community and from members of council. We're meeting next, the committee is meeting next week, February the 15th and the 16th, and will, as needed, continue on in the process throughout the first week of March. In fact, the 27th of February, the 28th, and the 1st and 2nd of March, if needed, to deliberate over the input that we're receiving through this process and the directions that the committee wishes to take in the budget process. So Kelly, I'll hand it back to you to start with our first questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So that does conclude our presentation. Just a reminder, if you want to submit a question, please use the Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen. Please don't use the chat. So our first question is, have you analyzed the revenue versus cost for bylaw services? Where do revenues from bylaw tickets go?
Thanks for the question. So revenue from bylaw tickets typically would be assigned to offset the operating costs of the service. In some cases, there are provincial offenses that attract revenues that are attributable to the province. And the revenue versus cost elements of the bylaw service are not the main influencing factors that go into setting the bylaw services budget. I would suggest that if there are debates about either the level of bylaw service being too high or too low, that's a legitimate conversation for someone to have with their councillor. But in terms of the bylaw services objectives, they're there to enforce the bylaws that council has approved to ensure that the features of the lifestyles that council wants residents to have in this community are being met. It isn't a revenue generating service. It isn't expected to earn a certain level of revenue, nor is it expected to earn or generate a certain level of enforcement activity. It's a complaint-based service that responds to the needs in the community. And in that case, then, the questions with respect to bylaw service are more about whether the bylaws are being enforced with the appropriate regard that council has for the objectives those bylaws were set up to achieve, and whether in the context of delivering those enforcement services, the officer is reflecting our customer service training and bringing the level of opportunity that we would expect them to bring to the role for educating residents just about what those bylaws are intended to do and why compliance is important. So that's the broad perspective. Mr. Folk is responsible for bylaw services in the organization structure. I'll ask him if he has any additional context to offer for a response. Mr. Folk, over to you.
I would only just, in reviewing the document, if that's where the question is coming from, the net budget for bylaw is approximately $1 million. So a little over $3 million taken in fees and licensing and certain revenues, parking being a part of that revenue suite as well, and about a little over $4 million worth of expenditures. And so I think Ed has, talked about the service level quite clearly. I'd add that over the last several years, there's been quite a few changes in this area. In particular, about 6 or 7 years ago, the bringing in-house of our animal control center. And so the bylaw enforcement folks were always accountable for the animal control and the bylaw aspects of patrolling and performing animal control within the community. But we now also, internally to our operations, house the animal control shelter, which is out on Red Deer Lake Road in Wahnapitae. Also, I would suggest, the most significant change, perhaps in the years since COVID and during the pandemic, was the constitution of a municipal law enforcement officer pilot, which has been firmed up into that budget along with bylaw and corporate security over the past several years. And the services there, again, began to become demanded during the pandemic and have continued, both in terms of security in the downtown, but also in terms of collaboration with our partners in social services, in housing and in sheltering, to be able to make sure that we have safe spaces for folks that are in our downtown and that are requiring additional services in the downtown to assist with their needs in terms of housing, in terms of transition potentially to housing, addictions and their safety needs within our downtown part of the community. And so there's been quite a bit of change in that area. I'll leave it at that. Certainly happy to answer any follow-up questions that the questioner may have.
Great. If our capital budget is less than previous years, does this mean fewer roads are getting fixed? Is it possible to take money from reserves to expand road work this year?
Thanks for the question. I don't know that it means fewer roads are getting fixed because, of course, nature of the repair work on any section of road is driven by the needs of that section. And so a single roads project is not like another roads project in anything other than the category of work that goes into the effort. The cost will vary, the need of the project itself will be different each time. So the likelihood is that with the level of spending on the roads network this year relative to the other capital priorities, the potential exists for council to make all kinds of it, either to direct more funds towards the roads budget, and that can be from a series of reserves, or it could be from additional elements of the tax levy. And if it chooses to do that, it can also adjust the capital plan by taking some projects that are currently recommended and postponing them or canceling them altogether. So there's a lot of ways that you can adjust the budget to reflect a set of perspectives about what level of road work or which particular roads are included in the plan. And I'll ask Mr. Rocca to weigh in, but our approach to developing the projects that are included for council's consideration in the capital plan follows a fairly rigorous and standard approach to evaluating the features of the projects themselves. So considering the risk of an asset failing, the consequence of that asset failing, if it does, would increase its priority relative to other potential projects. And the same goes for segments of the road network, where there's condition information that suggests there are some segments that are of higher priority than others. They may have more cost attached to them, and that may influence the overall amount of road work that can be done in terms of the number of projects. But given those risk assessments, they are recommended because the potential for something to create a service interruption is, in our view, too high for us to not recommend the project. Mr. Rocca, perhaps you want to include some other perspectives on how we identify and manage the variety of roads needs that we know exist across the network. Sorry, Joe, we can't hear you.
There we go. Maybe they tried that way instead. Okay, sorry about that. What I was saying was Ed, you gave a very thorough answer, so I don't have a lot more to add. But the one thing we definitely have to consider as well when considering road projects is the other assets within that road network that are beneath the road network that may also require a renewal at that time. So you think of the latest project we had on Barry Down Road, which was driven by water and wastewater needs, which gave us also an opportunity to rehabilitate the top of the road and provide some additional infrastructure that had been identified in our master plan. So there are a lot of different variables that go into how road projects are chosen, including condition, but including the future demands of the road network that we're projecting, as well as the other goals we're trying to achieve through our strategic plans and through our strategic plans as an organization and as a city.
Thanks, Joe. Kevin, anything further from a financing perspective that would be relevant to the question?
Well, thanks, Ed. I think the financing is exactly it too. There is, of course, the need when you're looking at, in particular, roads projects, which generally the larger the project might require, as Joe would say, probably 2 or 3, sometimes 4 years in order to get work completed, bid and designed, and the most, our larger projects completed. So you really have to take a long-term view in terms of budget. I've mentioned a third already. So the 155 million includes 50.6 million worth of road capital investment. And the 2022 number for roads capital investment was 62.6. So 62 versus 50. We know also that during budget deliberations, and this was a part of the question, I believe, could committee decide to put some additional monies to road work in 2023? The answer to that is yes, because that 62 million includes money that when we were at this stage of the budget in 2022 had not yet been directed. There was an additional 6.8 million directed by council last year that's included in that 62. And so the difference is 62 to 50. We need to be careful just comparing 1 year versus 1 year of roads capital spend, because it can be financing and project duration differences and subsequent decisions of committee as well.
Great, thanks everyone. Let me just pull up the next question here. In reference to the presentation, what is other? It's only 2% with a $155 million budget. That's $3 million. This person's just looking for some more clarification on that.
Thanks for the question. So, as I mentioned, we're in over 50 lines of service. And the details that Councillor McIntosh described in the 600+ page document that's currently on our website and available for anyone interested to review describes in much greater detail the broad categorization we've put together for illustration purposes this evening. So other includes those costs that weren't specifically identified, but it reflects services like our Auditor General's office. It reflects services related to committee and council support, and it would reflect other services that are part of our legislative responsibilities and some of the costs of the administration as well, excluding library. So that would be, you know, the mayor's office, council, my office and the CAO's office, as well as some of our communication services as well. So there's a number of services there that if you start to individually itemize them on a graph like that, the effect of the number of bars you're looking at starts to lose their overall impact and creates a focus on details that at the end of the day, when we're talking about a $700 million budget, may not be the ones that are of primary importance to either residents who are interested in seeing their service levels being addressed in the draft plans presented, or from councilors' perspective, focusing on those changes they could make that have the most significant impact from either a financial or service perspective. But thanks for asking.
Okay, our next question. I did not see a report to council on the cost of the human capital management plan, but see it in the 2022 and 2023 budget. How much will be spent in total and in 2023? How many employees are on it? When did it start and when will it be done?
Well, thank you for the questions. The human capital management plan is a multi-year effort, and it's been described in several different reports to council. So I'm not sure that you haven't seen it. You can check agendas online and you can see references to it in various reports. The overall project budget is approximately $500,000, and it includes 4 components, and it's designed to create an environment for staff that ensures they're in an environment that supports them in doing their best work. They have the training they need to perform their roles effectively, and that the organization is taking advantage of technology to make the workflows as efficient as possible. And so there, as I said, 4 components focusing on developing effective leaders. And that's not just leadership skills for today's leaders, it's leadership skills in environments where we are in a series of retirements and a lot of turnover is going on. And so we want to make sure people are ready to step into responsible roles now and in the future. Making sure that from a workforce capacity perspective, we have skills across the organization and trained staff ready to perform the work that council needs us to provide. As well, we need to make sure that we have a policy framework and processes in place to ensure that we have a diverse, a healthy, and respectful workplace. And the 4th element of the human capital management plan relates to innovation and ensuring that we take advantage of technology wherever possible. We develop process improvement opportunities to ensure that costs are minimized and that service remains effective. And so the most specific example that I can think of as part of the human capital management plan work has to do with the digitization of our recruitment process. Currently today within the City of Greater Sudbury, to be a candidate for an employment opportunity, you're submitting a resume or an application through either email or on paper. And the process in the administration of reviewing that information and identifying you as a potential candidate that should be interviewed and carrying through to the final stage of making an offer and getting an acceptance is a pretty manual one that in most organizations, many organizations, has been replaced with technology tools that makes that process much more digital and automatic. We are developing those tools in the organization with a view to making the process more efficient and ensuring that there is a record that follows you as an employee to recognize where there are training that's been taken or opportunities for further training to create the succession plans that I was talking about, and that there is a relationship with you as an employee from the beginning of your time with us through to the time when you leave as a retiree or as a former employee, and that the information is sustained throughout the relationship with you so that we can keep track of all your safety training, the performance records that need to be maintained to show you as a prospective candidate for more responsible positions, and minimize the amount of paper that exists today in the organization. So it's a transformation exercise first, and there are various elements of it. Some of them have costs, some of them have expected benefits. And we report to council on those regularly as the milestones are reached, typically as part of my quarterly performance reporting, but as well through other channels as results are delivered. There are a number of employees involved in the project on a part-time basis. And so we've got one dedicated employee who is responsible for directing the overall project. And she set up a series of working groups made up of staff from across the organization who are putting some of their time into this project, but are not being supported in any way by the project itself. They're contributing their time and expertise, and then the results of the project are being delivered as I described. Thanks for the question.
Thanks, Ed. Excuse me. Next question is, the city budget has a number of business cases. Are these included in the overall budget? If not, how does council decide which ones and how many they want to include? Will it affect the tax rate, and by how much?
Thanks for the question. So business cases are changes in service level that council has asked us to prepare because they would like, through this budget process, to consider whether to include them in the final approved plan. So the objective of a business case is to focus attention on a particular change in service that through this process, council can review explicitly and decide whether it wants to, and it can often be an additional service level or an addition to the capacity of an existing service, or it could be a service reduction with the expectation that there's a net cost reduction in the overall budget. Each of those is presented for council's individual consideration because yes, they each can have an impact on the tax levy. So whether they do or not is up to council, and how many of them get considered is also up to council. But through the course of the last 12 months, as ideas have been developed, and to avoid the potential for choices to be made in the middle of the year, which have a financial consequence that affect future years' budgets, council's established this process for identifying and compiling all these change ideas and presenting them as one package so they can be considered relative to the other ideas and in the overall context of a plan that has a property tax impact at the end of the day. So whether council includes any of them is completely their choice, and they could debate all of them and still not include any of them. That's also up to council. They're there, and we're there to support their deliberations about them if they'd like to talk about them further. But they're there because they asked us to develop them and put them in the plan for their consideration. How they consider them or to what extent they do is really their choice.
Thanks, Ed. The next question is, how much is inflation affecting our city's budget? Does a 3.7% tax increase get the same level of services as before, or do we have fewer services now?
Thanks for the question. So inflation affects the municipal budget like it affects your home budget or your experience in any kind of setting, whether that's in a restaurant or grocery store, as I alluded to earlier in our presentation. The price of the inputs that we use to deliver services is affected by inflation, and sometimes by a significantly greater level of inflation than the consumer price index number that typically gets quoted. So 3.7% is the number that was projected to be the tax change in our long-range financial plan. So we have a 10-year forecast of revenues and expenditures based on the assumption that service levels will generally look consistent year over year. We update that every June for council's consideration. And it's informed by a number of assumptions, of course, but the current projections anticipated that there would be a 3.7% tax change to fulfill the objective of maintaining services and service levels over the course of the next 10 years in the 2023 budget. So that's where the 3.7% number came from. The current inflation rate, if it's higher than that, would of course suggest that there's some adjustments that would need to be made for us to be able to maintain service at the same level and still maintain that 3.7% change. So there's a process improvement opportunity. There's an investment we make today that saves money for the city down the road, and or there's an adjustment to service levels that bring the overall package of services in line with those cost expectations. But an inflation that's higher than that 3.7% change would create an additional pressure on our ability to maintain existing service levels. And that's what we were describing earlier, and that's what council spends a lot of time thinking about through this budget review process, because there are not just inflationary pressures, but labor supply pressures and supply chain disruptions that cause suppliers and ourselves to buy more inventory and create a cushion against the risk that there's going to be some disruption down the road because supplies aren't there when we need them. And so we'll spend more now to reduce the risk of a service interruption later. And those kinds of factors also influence the overall capacity for service delivery throughout the organization. But yes, inflation is one of those things. So thanks for the question.
Okay, our next question is, can you break down the current roads category into what goes toward road maintenance and what goes to winter maintenance?
Thank you. I'll ask Mr. Rocca to confirm, but I believe we have roughly $22 million for winter control, and the balance, which is I think over 40 million, to other road maintenance. Mr. Rocca, over to you.
Thank you, Ed. So our total roads operating budget is 47.4 million, of which 23.7 million goes towards winter maintenance. So winter maintenance includes things like snow plowing, snow removal, clearing of pothole patching, sand street sweeping during the spring months. And then the remainder goes towards summer maintenance activities like line painting, sign maintenance, ditching, catch basin cleaning, and any of those general activities that you'd expect us more to do over the summer months.
Thanks, Joe. Our next question is loops back to the question we had earlier about the 2% other category. It says you talk about economic development, which is at the lower of the 2%. If you can break down economic development, why can you not break down the 3 million plus in the other category?
Well, thanks for the question. I think I answered this, or version of this question, just a few minutes ago, but I'd point you to the draft budget that's available for review on our website. There's over 600 pages of detail there. And the information that's presented here is summarized purposefully to support a general discussion about the issues and the influencing factors on the plan, and to hear questions from residents who are interested in particular elements of the service that'll inform council's deliberation. There's a lot of different ways we can break this information down. We made a choice to present it here in a summary form, but the detail is available at the lowest possible level in the draft budget, and that's available on our website. So I'd encourage the questioner to take a look there and review it. And if there are specific service questions, there are channels available through Over to You, our engagement portal, and 311, of course, to address some of those more specific service-oriented detailed questions.
Thanks, Ed. This is another question related to roads. It says, I read in the paper that if the city does not spend at least $80 million a year on roads to maintain them at a fair condition, they will degrade to a poor condition by 2030. I think you just covered what we're spending on roads this year, but what is considered fair and what is poor? How much would we need to spend to get them, to increase them to a good condition? Now that's a lot of question, but I can break that down if that's easier.
Thanks, Kelly. I'll ask Mr. Folk and Mr. Rocca for an assist. I'll describe generally the approach we take to our asset management reporting. So every municipality in Ontario has a responsibility to identify the condition of the assets that it's managing on the community's behalf. And the province hasn't got very many standards in place for how that condition assessment is done. But typically, given the subject matter expertise of the engineers, for example, involved in managing our roads networks, or our facilities managers involved in managing our buildings, their associations have some technical guidance that supports a general and consistent understanding of how to make these kinds of evaluations of the condition that the assets are in. And so those technical guidelines would inform our assessments of the current condition. And then similarly, experience and benchmarks would inform choices about what the level of investment would need to be to change the current condition from what it is to something different, typically a better condition than the one that it is now. And those details are summarized in a report that's presented, well, we will be presenting them annually, at least, to City Council. And as it happens, the current asset status report is on an upcoming agenda. So I'll ask Mr. Folk to describe that. And then I'll ask Mr. Rocca to assist with information about what distinguishes a road that's in fair condition from a road that's in poor condition. And whether we have some perspective or advice for council on levels of spending that would bring the entire network up to the good condition that would be associated with the classification system that we use. So Mr. Folk, and then to Mr. Rocca.
So thanks, Mr. Archer. It's tomorrow night, in fact, at council. There is an information report that contains a handy little report card for a variety of asset classes, one of which is roads. And so I think perhaps the questioner has been reading a story, either has read the report or looked at the report, or has been reading a number of stories that have been written about this report coming forward to council tomorrow. And so in 2021, staff presented what we call core infrastructure asset management plans. And so there are a number of asset classes at the city that we're analyzing, studying, and planning for in terms of their ongoing requirement for investment. The core assets are, roads are included, water, wastewater, stormwater management, roads, bridges, and large culverts. At the same time, we came with fleet and municipal parking lots. We still have to do buildings and facilities, parks and recreation, and solid waste, and include, in terms of building and facilities, our large cache of social housing units as well. So about 1,850 odd social housing units as well. And so there is still some work going on in this plan, but question or might be interested to know that the first batch of asset plans that we brought to City Council, effectively we said, you have a requirement of about 1.98 billion, not million, $billion in order to be able to keep those in the state of repair that they're providing service at right now. So that's not making a judgment at all. It's just, here's the current level of service. You wanted to keep the current level of service, you're about $2 billion in terms of investment requirement to keep that going in the next 10-year period. We'll be adding to that in 2023 and 24 with these other asset classes that I mentioned, the housing, the facilities, and others. So you can anticipate a number that would create a zone around probably $3 billion or slightly perhaps less than $3 billion that the city needs to be investing each year. We've just said the capital plan is roughly $155 million for this year. So 10 years of $155 million gets you about half the way to $3 billion, not $3 billion over a 10-year period of time. And so we know this is where the choices come in a capital budget. And we utilize the information in our asset management plans by class to set priority. You know, what's going to get priority this year? Is it going to be roads, or is it going to be some of our facilities needs, which are obvious to those that utilize the facilities, which create service disruption sometimes too? Or is it going to be the water, wastewater assets, as I mentioned, which require a plan to be fully funded up and sustainable in the longest run for all the right reasons around clean drinking water and making sure that we have that service well provided for moving forward. So the numbers that the individual who's raised the question provided are good numbers. They're numbers directly from the report. The average annual reinvestment need as a subset of that 1.98 billion is about 80 million for roads, just the roads classification within our asset management plans. And so we've mentioned tonight that we're investing about 50 million. Our our capital funding requirement being 80, then you've got a gap, and the gap between that $80,000 maintenance of our current level of service is about $35 million then. So about $30 to $35 million. And so what that means in terms of the condition of the road network moving forward, I'll pass it over to Joe, because there's the technical pavement condition index that you'll see in this report. But of course, there's way more to having a smooth driving experience on a road than just the pavement condition index. And so there are a number of factors that we would take into place, take into consideration when making investment decisions and putting that those decisions into play. So I'll pass it over to Joe, just with that bit of context in terms of our overall asset management planning approach.
Thank you, Kevin. And you're right, there are a lot of different factors that go into roads asset management planning. Paving condition index does drive a large portion of that conversation, but we do look at other factors like economic development opportunities. So we look at where are we expecting growth within the community, and where do we want to invest our funding to help match that growth as it comes online. We also consider safety factors. When we look at a road network, are we seeing portions of that road network that have a higher than expected number of collisions occurring? And are there improvements we could make through capital programming that can address those concerns? I already touched on before the opportunities to coincide some of these projects with water wastewater projects. That also is part of the factor that we consider. And when you roll all of those different items together, it helps us derive what the highest priority should be on our road network and where we should invest. To the question about what is a fair condition road and what is it going to take to move it into a good condition or higher, I suppose. Those ratings are strictly based on the pavement condition index. And the pavement condition index looks at a multitude of factors that we collect on our roadways every 2 years. It looks at different types of cracking on those roadways, rutting. It looks at the roughness of the roadway. So actually, literally, how much does the road move up and down as you drive on it? You combine all of those different factors and you roll them up into a PCI value, a pavement condition value. So a road that is rated fair on that pavement condition index value scores between 40 and 55. Anything above that, it gets you into the good or very good category. I think that gives a kind of a brief overview of kind of where those numbers come from. Kevin touched on the $80 million. The $80 million identified in the asset management plan is to maintain the current level of service we have on our roads, or the current pavement condition on our roads. So to start improving the condition overall of our roads, we're looking at investing. You need to look to invest more funds above that $80 million per year.
Thanks, Joe. Our next question is, under which category is the money spent on resolving the homeless issue and opioid overdose crisis?
Thanks for the question. So I'm anticipating that the questioner is referring to the presentation we made at the beginning of the session tonight. And in that case, those would be services generally associated with the social services elements of our work. There would be some that would be also included in our service partners, as well as our citizen and leisure services areas. But Mr. Jakes is a general manager of community development, and I'll ask him to describe the approach we take for managing services related to our homelessness and opioid response efforts, because they're extensive and they involve a lot of community partners. And the costs of the work are one element. The outcomes that we're able to generate and the support that we're able to provide those who need it is also a really important element. So, Mr. Jakes, if you could describe briefly how we arrange our approach to responding to those service needs, I'd appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Archer. The question is to where the funding comes from. The funding obviously comes through social services. A bulk of our funding to address a homelessness issue comes through the province, through the Ministry of Social Services and Children's Services. So those funds are transferred on an annual basis to address homelessness issues, which help support the shelters that we have in place, both men's and women's shelters, as well as youth shelters. go to fund those operations, ensure there are beds available. There are programs available through that funding as well. We support through our community partners like Centre de Santé to deliver outreach services to the community. Work hand in hand with Community Mental Health, CMHC, as well as HSN, and those organizations all help address the issues with our homelessness population. We've got an extensive plan that's been put in place. Some of that plan, which is regards to transitional housing and our ACT program, that program was funded through council. However, with the anticipation that at some point the province would fund those, as those are clinical responses, and clinical responses are an Ontario Health matter. And it's not one of the lines of business that the municipality is in providing health services to individuals. However, in this circumstance, it was felt it was really important, obviously, to our community, to the residents of our community who are vulnerable and experiencing distress through mental health and addictions issues, that council stepped up to fund those programs until the province got around to funding. So we are waiting, obviously, for the province to make some decisions as to what they're going to do with regards to funding mental health and addictions. With regards to the opioid crisis, the city doesn't receive any dollars to address opioid issues within our municipality. The opioid issue is a public health issue. Funding would come through Public Health Sudbury District or through Ontario Health via way of the hospital in dealing with its outreach and crisis beds that they have for individuals who are experiencing mental health or addictions issues. So from that perspective, to answer the question, there's a lot of flow through dollars that come from the province. We have set plans in place to address the issues within our community. We work collaboratively with numerous agencies and organizations throughout the city of Greater Sudbury to address and provide services to our homeless population, as well as those suffering from mental health and addictions. That helps.
That's great. Thank you. Next question is about the red light camera initiative. How long before this pays for itself? Where is the revenue reported on the budget or in the budget?
Thank you for the question. So certainly we can address the questioner's interest in the revenues. That's not why we have red light cameras, however. Red light cameras are a community safety service intended to facilitate safer roads and safer pedestrian movements in our city. Now, Joe Rocca has been leading the effort to establish the service here in our community, so I'll ask him to address the questioner's inquiry, but Joe, feel free to describe some of the other outcomes associated with red light camera service, in addition to the questions about the revenue associated with it.
Thank you, Ed. And you touched on it perfectly. The red light camera program is not intended to actually generate any revenue. In a perfect world, we would eliminate all red light camera running, and we would generate no revenue. It would only be an expense for the community. In terms of how it's going, unfortunately, we had a lot of revenue at the beginning of a lot of tickets issued at the beginning of the program up until the Christmas season, which, as someone who has spent a lot of time in road safety work, gave me pause to see the number of tickets being issued in our community. Fortunately, they have started to decline, is what I would report on in a general sense. We will be providing a more detailed response and an overview to the operations committee later this year as part of one of our annual road safety reports, and it'll detail the number of offenses that have been issued and the overall net benefits we're seeing in terms of reducing the number of collisions that are occurring at these intersections and nearby intersections. The cost of the program itself, it breaks even when we issue about 6 tickets a year or 6 tickets a day. Early on, it was definitely in that range where it was a revenue neutral program. And as we continue to move forward, that's the hope, if not to see it go into negative. The revenue itself is reported in the Provincial Offences Act courts line item in the budget. We believe there's about $580,000 budgeted in there for revenue. I think, yeah, generally speaking, that's the red light camera program. You're going to see us bringing forward reports on automated speed enforcement, or you have seen us bring forward reports on automated speed enforcement. It's a similar type program where we're trying to improve road safety in our community. And although there is a revenue component to it, the overall goal of automated enforcement in general is to change driver behavior throughout the community without the need to have police officers at every location at all the times. And they have been proven to be extremely effective in other communities, and I truly believe they will be effective here in Sudbury as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Joe. Not seeing any other budget related questions in the queue right now, so I'll put out a last call. Just to note, we have received some very specific questions related to operations in various areas this evening. So just a reminder that if you have questions or concerns about city services, please contact 311. We'll just give it a couple of minutes to see if there's any last questions before we call it a night. Okay. Okay, seeing none, so we will conclude the session. I will ask Mayor Lefebvre and Councillors McIntosh and Cormier if you have any closing remarks.
Thank you, Kelly. I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank everyone for your questions and sharing certainly your insights, as well as it's important for us to hear from you. So this is why we create these forums that are accessible to everyone, online, virtual. And I really want to thank the team, to Ed and the whole executive team for being here and certainly answering all of the questions. As you can see, budget deliberations and what we're moving forward with, and certainly a lot of further conversations to have and a lot of discussions. And certainly as we look at all the business cases that we have in front of us, as we look at all of our options. And I'm glad that we have a lot of that leadership in the hands of Councillor McIntosh, who is leading us in this round of the last push with respect to getting the budget approved and ensuring that we do our best to make sure that these investments, the key investments that are made here in the city of Greater Sudbury, that's what people want, and that's what we need as well. So with that, I will turn it over to Councillor McIntosh for a few words. Thank you, everyone. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Mayor Lefebvre. And it is a team effort. The 2023, every budget is a team effort of our staff, our community, and City Council to arrive at a budget that we can, that lays the road forward for the next year for us. And so I encourage the community to go over to you and submit your questions, any questions you might have. You can also reach out to your councillors, your very own ward councillor, who could also ask questions on your behalf if you're having difficulty understanding something you're reading in that 624-page document. Again, so thank you everyone for participating, and have a good night. I guess I'm supposed to pass it over to Councillor Cormier if he has anything to add.
No, that's fine. Thank you, Councillor McIntosh, Mayor Lefebvre, and thank you to everyone for being here tonight, including our attendees and, of course, all of the panelists and our staff. So I'll just echo those thanks. Thank you, everyone.
Before we close it, Mr. Archer, any final comments?
Thank you. I just echo thanks to our councillors and Mayor Lefebvre for the collaboration that's been on display throughout this process, and to the staff who've helped bring us to this point. As we've heard from the questions and the discussion that generated from questions like tonight's and last week's session, there's a lot of significant interest in these services. They're important. So look forward to the next few weeks, and thank everybody for the collaboration and the participation. Appreciate it. Take care.
All right, thanks so much, everyone. And just a reminder that we will be publishing your questions and answers on the budget project page on Over to You in the coming days, as well as the recording of tonight's session. So thank you so much for your time and have a great evening.